Ransom Letter Publishing and Ransom Letter Radio proudly present
Ghost Story, 10th Anniversary Edition, as read by the author, Benjamin Silas Foster. When a best-selling author flees his city home for a remote hunting cabin after his affair with a prominent detective's wife comes to light, strange things begin happening within the confines of the snowed-in cabin walls. A mysterious caller assures the alcoholic writer that he is not who he thinks he is, and he can't shake the feeling that something, or someone, is watching him from the mirrors. In this cerebral horror story, Ernest Leonard will come to a terrifying new understanding of the fragility of the psyche, the soul, and identity itself. Featuring newly revised and edited text and a foreword by the author. For more on the author, visit amazon.com/author/Benjamin Foster. For more on Ransom Letter Publishing, visit linktr.ee/Ransom Letter Publishing or email ransomletterpublishing@gmail.com. Forward. Sometimes I write drunk and revise sober, he had said, and sometimes I write sober and revise drunk. But you have to have both elements in creation, the Apollonian and the Dionysian, or spontaneity and restraint, emotion and discipline. Peter DeVry, Reuben. I've always wanted to cultivate a creative practice like Stephen Pressfield. Up before dawn, at one with the keyboard, churning out 000 daily word counts. The blue-collar, ink-slinging equivalent of the archetypal armored knight, riding into battle, methodically mowing down dragons with a shining, freshly sharpened saber, and circling back unscathed for 2 massive slabs of mutton, a quick meditation, and a roll in the hay with the missus, all before midday. In pursuit of the craft, I have long attempted to fully embrace Pressfield's war of art ideology in both philosophy and action, and I would like to think these days, on my better days, I'm beginning to glimpse the kind of gumption it would take to wield the pen with that kind of power. But up until my early 30s, when I feel for the first time I began consciously to wholly devote as much of my soul as possible to what David Lynch termed the art life, for me, writing was less a spiritual marriage with the divine than a wild fuck at 3 a.m. An auspicious collaboration with a mistress of smoke and drink for whom to satisfy I would remain penniless, reclusive, and without sleep, waiting on her call. None of that is to say I didn't take her seriously. In fact, I was so serious in my pursuit of her that I thought it best not to approach until those sacred witching hours, when the veil is thinnest and perceptions all around would be somewhat askew in my favor. Now, this kind of lifestyle is objectively bad form for any kind of creator and spoken against by both of the aforereferenced auteurs and artists of all kinds whose work has inspired me and whose thoughts on such matter I have come to value. Still, as unfortunate as it may be, I do somewhat believe that there are stories that may just feed on the souls of their creators and therefore must be exorcised from the spirit late at night with a sharpened pen under deep inebriation. If you don't get those types of stories out quick enough, they can end you. If a balance can be maintained for a certain amount of time, however, and one can keep composed on the seas of angst and starving artistry, with an ultimate plan of escape and survival, I do believe there is a kind of writing that only this kind of desperation could produce. And as much these days as I am attempting to put upon the full armor of a warrior artist on the Pressfieldian path and trying my damnedest to embody what it is to live Lynch's art life, I can never regret my time spent as a drunken devotee of the goddess of infinite flow and unending creation. After all, it was at her feet where I would meet a man who I would find out was one of her most faithful worshippers. A man, much like myself at the time, committed to a delirious engagement with divinity for capture in his written work. A man perhaps committed so much so that his desire had given way to drunken infatuation, then to lust, then to death, then to a strange trip adrift beyond the bonds of life. A man named Ernest Leonard. A man who wanted me to tell his story. a ghost story. I was very much so engulfed in the process of divine inspiration by way of debauched desperation while putting Ernest's ghost story onto the page over the winter of 2015 and into the spring of the following year. The inspiration for the story was eclectic, from the bursting horror of anthologies like Tales from the Crypt and the creeping thoughtful terror of The Twilight Zone to the isolation of Paul Auster's The New York trilogy, an influence on all of my creative work in general, and the environmental entrapment of Tarantino's The Hateful Eight, itself inspired by John Carpenter's The Thing. Both of the latter being films in which the snow becomes a character itself. The idea of a blizzard personified was the motivation for one of my favorite structures I conceived of for the story. The way certain sounds are used for subtextual mood lighting, being returned to again and again in the narrative. The more I played around with this idea, the more I began to imagine something similar to Sergio Prokofsky's use of musical instruments as characters in his symphonic rendition of Peter and the Wolf. In Ghost Story, when you hear the howling wind, this is Ernest's seclusion creeping up on him, reminding him just how far he truly is from his home. Hear now the scheming and mysterious predator, lurking in the shadows of the cabin's every corner, played by the droning ring of the rotary phone. The voice of Peggy Lee, representative of Ernest's own goddess muse, Mona, the singular beacon of hope throughout the story. And of course, the breaking shovel, subtly hinting at the fate that awaits Ernest as he continually finds himself falling deeper and deeper into a grave that has already been dug for him. On the evening of what I believed would be the final writing of the original draft of Ghost Story, I decided to throw Ernest a going-away party. I was staying alone at my sister's house in Cleveland, taking care of her animals while she was away for work. I'd procured 2 bottles of the cheapest wine Walmart had to offer, California Dream. It's still to this day some of the best I've ever drank, and rolled a fat-ass blunt with the last loose remnants of my most recent bag. I lit that shit up, took a few gulps straight from the bottle, and started typing, not knowing that by the time I was done, Ernest Leonard would be gone without ever having said goodbye. When I woke up the next afternoon, I drove to Waffle House in a daze. I quickly chose a booth and opened my laptop, staring at a blank page, hoping Ernest had at least left me something to go on. The waitress said I looked like a writer. I responded, "That's funny. I'm struggling with a story right now." She asked what it was about. "I'd read it," she approved excitedly after I'd given her the best 30-second synopsis I could muster. "Thank you. It needs an ending, though." At that moment, as she'd finished refilling my cup of black coffee and sashayed away, the bell above the door rang as a man entered the restaurant. He found his way to my table, took the seat across from me, eyed me up and down suspiciously, and spoke. "My name is Harold Price. I know more than likely this is not the way you had expected this story to end, and by God, I wish I could tell you that it didn't." Fast forward almost a decade to 2026, and I'm found mostly sober these days and seeking to keep to the Pressfieldian path in pursuit of Lynch's art life. I have continued to keep in touch with Harold long after finishing what I believed at the time would be my final composition of Ernest's Ghost Story with his help, however. He and I have spoken on and off ever since that day, 10 years ago, at the Waffle House in Cleveland in the spring of 2016. I have always known he would have a story of his own that he'd ask me to tell eventually. Harold called me recently, phone ringing in the middle of the night, rousing me from a deep sleep. He said he'd met a girl by the name of Samantha, who herself had become embroiled in a string of murders and a case of confused identity. We talked for a while about his continuing investigation before he abruptly cut me off and told me he had to go, promising to call again when he had more details. Before he hung up, he took a beat and sighed heavily, seemingly not wanting to continue on to reveal the true nature of his call. Slowly, calmly, assuredly, Harold Price finally murmured into the telephone, "Ernest Leonard is still alive." And now, please enjoy the 10th anniversary edition of Ghost Story. My father was a gravedigger. He taught me to move earth with shovel and strength. He taught me to split soul in two and sever root with my spade. He taught me to honor the worm and the maggot and all manner of creature that help us transition from this plane to the next. My father was a gravedigger. He taught me when you dig a man a grave, you may as well dig your own. Ernest Leonard, gravedigger. Ernest Leonard was drunk, exhausted, and too depressed to kill himself. He lay sprawled on the plaid green and yellow couch, the same 70s sofa that had been in the cabin's living room since he was a boy. A sci-fi mystery novel he'd been going through the motions with earlier in the evening was draped over his face. Ernest was attempting to sleep to no avail. Every so often he would raise the cover of Diana Obsidian in the case of the magic bullet just high enough to allow the bottle of Coal Mine Kentucky bourbon to part his lips. The blizzard winds outside howled like a pack of unknown creatures in the night, and Ernest figured the snow must have consumed the tiny hunting cabin by now, a thought he greeted with another 4 gulps of bourbon. Ernest had inherited the cabin from his father's estate 6 months before. Since the year Ernest had turned 14, he and his father had made the trek to the cabin for a week every autumn. His father would go out hunting during the day, and Ernest would lock himself away in the cabin's one bedroom with his father's old Remington typewriter and fill page after page with early versions of the kind of stories that would establish his foundation as one of the best-selling authors in the country just a few years later. He'd driven the 4 hours out of the city and through the wilderness 3 days before, for the first time since the death of his father. The cabin had always been where he'd penned his best material, and was half the reason he'd made the trip. Since the ruination of his latest romantic affair, Ernest hadn't been able to write so much as a paragraph without thinking not only it, but all his work shit and himself a hack. Mona. His dear sweet Mona. His muse. She had also just so happened to have been the wife of a highly decorated police detective who had just so happened to take it very personally when someone else was fucking her. A hushed phone call in the middle of the night informing Ernest her husband had found out about them and was on his way to kill him was the other half of the reason he'd made the hasty retreat to his father's cabin. He'd thrown a few mismatched pairs of pants, shirts, and underwear, along with 6 bottles of bourbon, into a beat-up old suitcase he'd used while doing book tours, and had been out of his house with the security system set in 20 minutes. He'd made a snow-laden midnight drive on forest roads, stopping only once, a drunken run for enough supplies to keep him alive for the next few days at the 24-hour gas-up, the only sign of humanity within 15 miles of the cabin. The first thing he'd unpacked through the cabin's door was a bottle of Coal Mine, which had promptly had the twist-off cap twisted off. The first 2 days Ernest had stayed drunk enough to abandon all ties to the corporeal realm. The snowstorm that had swallowed both him and the cabin, like the well had swallowed Jonah, must have come sometime during the blackouts. The decision to take it easier on the 3rd day had less to do with waking up with a god-awful headache and rushing to the bathroom to throw up than it did with the fact that he'd already downed 4 bottles and there would be no leaving the well's belly to restock on bourbon. When the old rotary phone began to ring on the wood end table directly beside where Ernest's head was lying on the armrest of the couch, it somewhat surprised him, considering he didn't know who would have the number to be calling the cabin, let alone who would even be paying the phone bill at this point. But he still didn't remove the book from his face or move it all until the 5th ring. He sat up, took a gulp of bourbon from the bottle, drunkenly removed the receiver from the cradle, and put it to his ear. "Yeah? Jack? Is this Jack?" The voice on the end of the line sounded deep and distorted, like the voice of a kidnapper making ransom demands in one of Ernest's novels. "I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number. No Jack here." With that, Ernest was content to lay the phone down and consider it all a product of mistake and happenstance, until, as he was replacing the receiver, the caller spoke again. "No, I am sure the number is correct. Ernest Leonard, you are not who you think you are." "Who is this?" In his drunkenness, the confusion of the strange voice on the end of the line, knowing him by name, had hit Ernest like a hard slap to the face, and the only way he knew to confront it was with anger. "Jack, you are not who you think you are." "I told you I'm not Jack. Who is this?" The surreal nature of the conversation had only served to enhance the feeling of inebriation, and when he thrust his head forward to yell into the phone, the entire room was sent spinning around him. "It's time to accept it, Ernest." "Is this Mona's husband? Are you coming to kill me?" He laughed sarcastically to hide the filling dread in his stomach. "Swallow the bottle of sleeping pills in the bathroom, Ernest." The voice sounded like a recording being played with the time slowed down, but it was level and calm. "Find the pistol and blow," was the last thing Ernest heard as he slammed the receiver down, hard onto its cradle. He sat there staring at the old rotary phone on the end table beside the couch for a full 5 minutes, listening to the wind and the snow whistle around the cabin walls. Just as he was regaining his drunken composure and about to turn away, the phone began to ring again, shattering the silence and jolting Ernest's nerves, making him jump nearly off the sofa. He watched the screaming telephone for 3 rings until working up the nerve and abruptly snatching it from the cradle. "Who are you?" he demanded again, yelling as he brought up the receiver before the phone had even reached his mouth. "You are not who you think you are," the same distorted kidnapper's voice. "If you're going to do something, just come up here like a man and do it. Stop calling me and just come up here and put a bullet in me, you limp-dick bastard," Ernest screamed into the phone. "Jack, you are..." He slammed the phone down again, this time sending the open bottle of coal mine off the end table, spilling precious puddles of his limited bourbon onto the orange shag carpeting. He leapt from the couch and grabbed the bottle before any more was lost, and crouching in front of the end table, kissed a small drink from it in apologies to the gods of drunkenness for the trespass. He found the black twist-off cap half buried in the carpet and replaced it. Perhaps he'd had enough for the night. He stood up and gave the room a second to recollect itself and stopped twirling around him before he tried moving. When he did, he walked to the gray stone fireplace that took up the whole of the furthermost wall of the cabin's living room and threw a log into the flames. He stared trance-like into the fire, racking his brain for an explanation for the phone call and wishing the terrible sense of foreboding apprehension would go away. In the back of his mind, he knew he'd never told Mona about the cabin, and neither had he given her or anyone else the number to the rotary phone he'd figured had been defunct for years now. But this rationalization didn't keep him from telling himself that it had been Mona's husband on the other end of the line. On his cell phone, driving through the snow, en route to the cabin to end the life of the hack rider who'd been fucking his wife. Yes, that's who it must have been. Mona's husband trying to mess with his mind, trying to drive him crazy before he killed him. Almost elated now, dedicated to his denial, Ernest decided that before the good detective came storming through the cabin door to blow his head off, that he would very much like to hear one of his father's old records. Something that had always made him happy during those weeks spent in the cabin as a boy. He threw another log onto the fire and turned to the vinyl player beside the couch. Opening the cabinet at the bottom of the player, he rifled through rows of records, stopping momentarily to study the dust jackets of vinyls like The Immortal Charlie Parker and Nancy in London, before pulling Peggy Lee's Is That All There Is single from the cabinet, one of his father's favorites. They had listened to the single on repeat in the autumn evening as they had shared a glass of cognac he was never to tell his mother about. He eased the record from its dust jacket and gently found the outermost groove of the player's needle. Nostalgic analog pops greeted him through the speakers as he sat back down on the couch, letting his head fall against the wall behind it, and closed his eyes. Peggy Lee's eternal voice floated to his ears, and he sang off time and loudly, mumbling the words he didn't know. "Is that all there is to a fire?" Ernest yelled drunkenly over the singer's spoken vocals and the screaming winds breaking on the cabin walls. It had always been his favorite line as a boy, and in his intoxication seemed as though it bore some weight over his present circumstance. Ernest grabbed the bottle of bourbon at his feet, twisted the cap off, and threw it across the room into the flames. "Fuck it!" he yelled to no one but himself and Peggy Lee, and took 6 more massive gulps of bourbon. If Mona's husband was making the 4-hour trip through the blizzard apocalypse to introduce him to a bullet, Ernest wanted to make good and damn sure he was as drunk as possible when that meeting occurred. He awoke a few hours later, the cold air trying to burn its way into his skin. His head weighed a ton, but he managed to lift it blurrily to find only soft embers where a roaring fire had been what seemed like only moments before.
Then let's keep dancing. Then let's keep dancing.
Peggy Lee repeated from the record player's speaker box, the needle stuck in some warped groove. Ernest tried standing and immediately sat back down. The room spun around him and the feeling he was going to vomit rose in his throat. When he tried again a few minutes later, he did so slowly and stood for a moment until he felt stable. He made his way across the room in small, cautious steps, his only light the glow of the dying embers. When at last he reached the record player, he pulled the needle from the record and was left with the white noise of the howling wind. Turning his attention to the fire, he dazedly fumbled with a small log before finally succeeding in casting it atop the pink embers, managing to get it to catch by rolling it around with the poker. As he returned the tool to its stand on the hearth, a movement in the antique mirror that hung above the mantelpiece caught his eye. Backing up to look into the mirror's reflection, he found that the entire surface had gone dark, not returning any of the light that the rising flames were now spreading across the room. As he stared into the glass surface, unsure of what was happening or what he should, or even could, do, his stomach filled with dread, his throat filled with vomit, and Ernest could swear the blackness inside the mirror had begun to ripple. Satisfied to leave his own personal piece of the void just as it was without further investigation, he backed away from the fireplace. But before he could turn and run, the black of the mirror's reflection gave way to the face of a dark figure staring down at Ernest's cowering form. The face was a man's. He looked slightly older than Ernest, his hair black, slicked back from his forehead and speckled with gray flecks. Scars and pockmarks crisscrossed his jaw. His eyes were appearing in unmerciful blue. His mouth moved, but no sound was audible. Ernest recognized the man instantly, but as hard as he tried in his increasing inebriation, couldn't place from where. When he turned and tried to run in a horrified frenzy, Ernest's foot caught the couch, sending him flying to the orange carpet, face first. He grabbed the bottle of coal mine just before him on the floor and, mustering all the courage he could, rolled over to confront the specter before it had broken the mirror's bonds and was on him. On his back now, bourbon bottle lifted, ready to send it shattering into his ghostly attacker, Ernest found nothing but his own reflection staring back at him in the antique mirror. He sat there for a moment, looking at himself, holding the bottle over his head, mouth still open in a war cry that had never been able to surface. He wondered what he had even been planning to do in the first place. Beginning to think he looked foolish, Ernest sat up on the carpet and straightened himself. Carefully, without taking his eyes from the mirror's frame, he lifted himself from the floor, with the bottle of coal mine tucked safely under his arm, and took the fireplace poker back from its stand. Holding the poker like a rapier, Ernest carefully backed up onto the steps that led into the cabin's kitchen, and then, through the kitchen to the wooden door to the bedroom, opening, closing, and locking it, without ever turning his back to the mirror. In darkness, Ernest sat as still as possible on the bed, only moving to grab his makeshift sword when he heard a bump in the night, sipping bourbon every so often. He fell asleep finally as the first rays of gray winter sunlight peeked through the bedroom window. He awoke early the following afternoon. The memory of the ghostly encounter had all but faded with the previous evening's dampening drunkenness. The only things remaining now were the sharp edge of a hangover, a headache, and the need to vomit. Ernest felt stupid when he laid his hand down on the metal of the fireplace poker wrapped in the sheets on the bed next to him, and he was happy enough to attribute what recollection he did have of the mirror's visage to the 3-day binge of a hack writer with an alcohol problem. When he rose out of bed after allowing his head to settle a moment, he found the fallen snow as high as the windowsill, fresh flakes still wafting from the sky. At the sight, he reached for the bottle of bourbon on the nightstand before thinking better of it. Ernest left the coal mine on its perch and went into the tiny kitchen that separated the cabin's living room and the bedroom, where he took a box of packaged pastries from the gas-up bag left unpacked on the table and put on a pot of coffee. He took his breakfast into the living room, where catching sight of the antique mirror over the mantel sent a chill through Ernest. He immediately pushed the feeling away, now grudgingly sober and angry at himself for still being afraid of the drunken delusion of the night before. Ernest ate on the couch as he once again tried investing himself in the copy of Diana Obsidian in the case of the magic bullet, turning pages between unwrapping cellophane until he'd emptied the box, when he retreated again to the kitchen for a cup of freshly brewed coffee. Returning, he put on the immortal Charlie Parker on the record player, and pulled his father's old Remington typewriter from its case beside the sofa. The pastries must have eased his stomach because he no longer felt like throwing up, and the coffee must have soothed his head because he was no longer concerned it may explode into bits of him at any moment. Finding his muse in Parker's bouncing saxophone, Ernest had even managed what seemed like magic and produced 8 pages of a new story by the time what little light the day had brought had vanished behind the window curtains. He had the 8 pages stacked nicely on the table in front of him, to the left of the typewriter, as he punched the Remington's old keys quickly. Finding his boyhood niche hard at work on a 9th, he was focusing on the etchings of new life on the page in front of him when the phone beside him began to ring. He leapt hard, bashing his knee on the underside of the coffee table, sending the paper scattering to the living room floor. Holding the battered appendage in both arms and sitting perfectly still, Ernest watched trance-like as the snot-colored plastic of the phone's body rattled furiously with every ring, like an uncoiling snake preparing itself to strike. He stared hard at the phone, immobile, until its ringing had ceased, and then for a few moments afterward. He'd collapsed on the couch, hands over his eyes, sober brain reeling, when the ringing siren split the sound of Charlie's swooning saxophone in half once more. In one swift movement, Ernest pulled himself from his discouraged vexation, found the telephone with his right hand, and clasped the hissing snake round the receiver. Yes. Ernest's voice betrayed none of his tension, slow, flat, calm. Ernest? The voice was one he knew well. The voice of an angel, a goddess, his muse. He smiled in spite of himself. Mona, thank God! How did you get this number? No, never mind that. The weirdest fucking shit has been going on up here, Mona. Please tell me you're calling to tell me your old man's off the warpath, that I can come home. Ernest, listen to me, okay? Just listen. There's something important I need to get through to you. I need you to listen so we can all rest, okay, babe? He smiled. Despite whatever dismal news she may have for him, at least he was talking to a real person. A person whose name, face, and body he knew well, and not some disembodied spectral caller. He was happy to carry on his usual charming, melancholious banter. Well, fuck, Mona. I guess this isn't the I left him and I'm waiting naked in your apartment for you right now call, is it? Ernest, listen to me. She paused a moment, and Ernest found himself staring at the floor, smiling for the first time in days. You are not who you think you are. Mona's voice rang in the receiver, a cold and rational monotone. His smile dissipated. His face went a ghastly pale, and the urge to throw up returned full force. The room spun around him. His confusion pulled at him like water, dragging him unwillingly into the depths. Fighting it, he clung hard to his rationale and let anger be its defense. You're in this with him, aren't you? You're doing this with him. You all must get some twisted fucking jollies out of all this. Fuck me, drive me crazy, and then kill me, right? Well, fuck you, Mona. Fuck you, and fuck him too, and fuck this twisted little game. I'm not playing this shit anymore. By the time he'd finished, he was screaming so loud his voice echoed back at him. Jack, listen. Don't fucking call me that. That's not my name. Ernest, please just listen. We all need peace. Despite Ernest's rage, Mona's voice stayed low and calm, almost a droning whisper in his ear. Ernest let the receiver clatter to the floor, his eyes opening and closing slowly, focusing on the snot-colored cradle dragging the other end of itself back by its cold tether. Mona kept talking, her voice only reaching his ears in hums and pitches now. Painfully sober, the sound of the winds breaking on the cabin walls and Mona's insistent pleas that he was the victim of some mistaken identity rattled the confines of his mind until it grew so loud Ernest could stand it no more. He charged the end table and violently seized the phone by the cradle. Jerking it up and above his head, Ernest ripped the telephone's wire from the wall in a fury. Holding it in both hands, he brought the rotary phone down again and again on the wooden end table until pale green plastic flew from its frame and bits of the rotary dial were bent inward. On both his knees, with the telephone held wildly in a single open palm over his head, Ernest stopped abruptly when the madness of the scene struck him full force. The remnants of the phone's shattered plastic body lay scattered throughout the orange shag carpeting. Blood ran in lines from Ernest's knuckles to his wrists. As he regained his composure and slowly strained himself from the floor, Ernest held the broken appliance like a rag doll, gazing down at it, wondering if what had just happened to him. Calmly, he turned to the fireplace and tossed the battered remains onto the fire. He pulled his makeshift rapier from the stand and jabbed at the embers, rousing the flames. For a moment, he stood there in the glow of it, watching the fire lapping at the plastic, blackening the pale green. When he turned away, smiling, he was suddenly struck with the pain in his hand for the first time. Replacing the poker, Ernest found the flesh on his knuckles had been ripped away by the wood table and the telephone's jagged, broken body. Balling and unballing his fist, he made for the tiny bathroom at the end of the short hallway opposite the fireplace, blood drops staining the orange carpet dark brown as he walked. In the bathroom, he found a roll of gauze inside the medicine cabinet. Sharing the same shelf was a bottle of Big Sleep sleeping pills that had turned his stomach upon laying eyes on them. When he'd reached for the bandages, the bottle had come clattering to the floor at Ernest's feet. He kicked it away in disgust and slammed the cabinet door, not wanting so much as to touch the things, let alone pick them up to return them to their spot with the other supplies. He watched himself apply the bandages in the mirror overhanging the sink as he hummed along with the immortal Charlie Parker, wanting nothing more than to forget the whole incident now that the phone would no longer be ringing. By the time he'd finished rapping his knuckles, Ernest had come to a decision to leave the cabin the following day, assuming the weather had cleared up. He'd go back to the city, forget about Mona, quit drinking, and begin work on a new novel. This reaffirming resolve had invigorated Ernest and had filled him with a renewed spirit and sense of purpose. Singing out the notes now and drumming along with Charlie Parker and Due West on the sink's ceramic, Ernest watched himself in the mirror as he celebrated his new resolutions. Seeing that a scraggly beard had begun to develop from his usual elegantly disheveled stubble, and that his hair was greasily matted to his forehead, Ernest decided a shave and shower would be an appropriate commemoration for his fresh intentions before the long road home. Taking his father's straight razor from the medicine cabinet, Ernest gave it a brisk run over the strop that accompanied it before using soap to lather his face. He ran the cool blade up and down the side of his cheek, dropping frayed hair into the sink and leaving the skin underneath smooth and glistening. He was caught up in the feeling of the razor on his jaw, the cold steel kissing the skin softly, still singing and humming along with Charlie Parker and his band on the record player when the scratching started. It was soft at first, but given the night's events, more than enough to snap Ernest from the trance of his straight razor shave. Dashing to the door of the bathroom and peering out in the short hallway, his face half-shaven, lather dripping onto the floor, Ernest could hear the scratching clearly. The sound was coming from the record player. He would have thought it was some perverted groove or a loose wire in the speakers, but this sound was different from any audio defect. This sound came from below the music, from beneath it. It was as if someone had recorded a dozen mice clawing for survival from a fate of suffocation in a crawl space underneath wooden floorboards and somehow placed it there, with the bouncing saxophone in frantic rhythm section. It was growing louder. As the scratching slowly consumed the music, a low gurgling had commenced from within the fireplace. The sound was on and off, like the death rattle of an animal screaming against the inevitable darkness before it. Like the scratching, it grew louder and louder with every sequence. Staring into the fireplace from the bathroom doorway, lather still dripping from his face, mouth dropped in awe, Ernest could see the source of the dying bray. There, atop the logs, surrounded and consumed in flames, sat the charred body of the old rotary telephone, and it had begun to ring. Though before the full horror of the moment could rain down upon Ernest, a hushed and monotone voice spoke from the record player's scratching. "Ernest, you are not who you think you are." Ernest's mind was reeling, and in his agonizing sobriety it seemed the world was fading around him as he backed further and further into the bathroom, not knowing how to, or if he could, escape the unfathomable terror waiting for him just outside the doorway. The record player's phantom voice repeated its message again and again at a slow interval, as if struggling to keep its hold in the physical realm as the burning telephone continued its undead, guttural ringing. It wasn't until he caught a glimpse of the mirror overhanging the sink, however, that Ernest had launched into the uncontrollable screaming. There he was, staring out from the mirror with those merciless blue eyes and into Ernest, with the void rippling all around him. That overbearing, recognizable face Ernest just couldn't seem to find the name of. His black hair slicked back, gray speckling throughout, his jaw and cheeks intercut with scars and pockmarks, his mouth moved perfectly in sync with the voice coming from the record player's speakers in the living room. "Ernest, you are not who you think you are." Still screaming, Ernest turned rapidly to escape the specter in the glass when his foot caught something underneath. The pill bottle rolled beneath Ernest's ankle, sending him off balance and tumbling backwards. When his head had hit the toilet seat, there was only an instant of dull pain, and then a sea of black. When Ernest's eyes opened, it was to a bright and blinding ceiling of glowing red stars. There were no sounds but the roar like the ocean waves in his ears. He lay there on the tile, considering the important things for a moment, such as his name, where he was, and why he was waking up on a bathroom floor. As the red galaxy and the deafening roar began to dissipate, the horror of the situation began flooding back to him, and Ernest sat up quickly, far too quickly, sending the room cascading into a tumultuous spin. He grabbed the straight razor at his feet, the blade out, ready to do whatever he could against some ghastly aggressor. He pulled up slowly, using the sink to steady himself. Through the doorway, he could see the glow of a roaring fire and hear logs crackling in the flames. The grotesque ringing of the charred infernal phone had ceased, as had the scratching and the voice from the record player. Neither was Charlie Parker's frenzied saxophone still serenading the cabin. Instead, Peggy Lee had now continued her singing from the evening before on Is That All There Is, a record Ernest hadn't put on. He tightened his grip on the pearl handle of the straight razor. Swallowing hard, he resolved to face whatever awaited him head on. Slowly, back hard against the wall, his weapon held at his side, ready to strike, he slipped through the doorway and around the corner. Ernest found him, sitting on the couch as he moved around the doorframe, and instinctively the razor, clutched in both hands, shot out in front of him. It was his specter sitting there, where Ernest had all afternoon, dressed all in black, dress pants, button-up shirt, and wingtips. His legs were crossed, both hands folded on top of them. He sat looking at Ernest with a slight smirk. He looked more like a friend dropping by for conversation than a malevolent poltergeist. "I will cut the fuck out of you!" Ernest screamed, brandishing the razor and waving it in front of him. "Ernest, we need to talk," said the specter, uncrossing his legs and letting his arms rest on his thighs, interlocking his fingers and looking calmly up at him. In response, Ernest leapt the length of the room, sending the coffee table, the typewriter, and the stack of blank paper stacked beside it crashing down on the orange shag carpet. He brought the razor down hard and fast, aiming for the edge of the man's black and gray hair to send the freshly sharpened blade deep into the flesh of his face. The specter sat calmly and sighed deeply. Suddenly, Ernest found himself back at the wall, the straight razor down at his side, the coffee table sitting upright, typewriter sitting soundly in the middle, stack of blank paper to its right. Behind it sat the specter, his arms still resting on his thighs, his fingers still interlaced, looking up at him with those frigid blue eyes. Ernest could remember charging him, trying to bury the razor in his face, but the memory was fading now, almost as if he dreamt it. "Unfortunately, it's the same with this fine bourbon you have here." The specter indicated to 2 glasses half full of whiskey that sat on the coffee table, the bottle of coal mine from the bedroom set beside them. Ernest tried remembering if they'd been there a few moments before, but the process had made him lightheaded. "I hope you don't mind. I figure a good drink would help you process all this better. The second glass is for ceremony only, as bad as I'd like to join you. If I were to reach down and take the glass from the table and try to send the delicious whiskey bouncing down my gullet, in a flash it would reappear on the table in exactly the same spot, not a single drop missing. Some kind of spectral physics, I suppose. Besides, I don't think a ghost could become intoxicated, do you, Ernest? It's the same with that razor you're holding there. That blade and myself can't exist in the same place at the same time. In the little time I've been in this state, I've managed to figure out some ways to break through to speak with you and to make impressions on this plane, but I'm not sure I completely understand how that's happening myself, and I still can't take a swig from a whiskey glass. Hopefully soon enough you'll experience what I'm talking about. You see, Ernest, you and I, just like the whiskey and the razor, have ceased to be able to exist in the same place at the same time." "Who are you?" Ernest mumbled, not knowing what to believe or what action to take. "Sit, Ernest. Have a drink. I'm weakening every moment just manifesting myself to be here with you. We don't have much time." Ernest walked the furthest he could from the coffee table to still reach the glass of bourbon and lifted it, eyes not leaving the man on the couch. He took the depth of the glass all at once and swallowed. He set the glass back down on the coffee table and stood opposite the couch, his eyes darting back and forth across the specter's face, trying to make some sense of it. The specter continued. "Ernest Leonard, you are not who you think you are." "So I've been told. I'll ask you again, who are you?" Ernest questioned, still standing in front of the couch, the straight razor along with his arms hanging limply at his side. He wanted to run, wanted to escape the cabin, but found himself enraptured in the moment. "A few days ago, Ernest, something happened. A few days ago, I killed you. I put 6 bullets in your chest, Ernest. through the silk sheets on the bed in my bedroom which you were wrapped in, naked, with my wife. My name is Jack Edelon. A few days ago, I was a prominent detective married to the love of my life, but you loved her too, Ernest, and she loved you." Ernest burst out laughing. Feelings of warmth and manic elation spread throughout him as he latched on to the first hints of some kind of explanation for all of this. He laughed long and hard, ignoring the lingering mysteries already eating at his fragile logic. "I may have been an excellent fuck, but I don't know if that makes me immortal. I'm glad you finally made it, but I'll tell you just like I did Mona, I'm not going to let you drive me crazy, and I'm not going to play your fucking games, so you may as well kill me if you're going to and get it over with." Finding cadence for his words and familiar anger, Ernest punctuated his remarks by indicating the open blade of the straight razor, but the specter went on undeterred. His iridescent blue eyes stared past Ernest, and he spoke softly, almost monotone. "You didn't die, though, Ernest. Instead, something else happened. Instead, you forced me into this manifestation, this shell of an aura of a man, and you continued living through me. Instead, I was forced into that vast emptiness in which no living man is intended to tread. Don't ask me to explain it. Even in this state, especially in this state, there are incredible and terrifying mysteries that abound. Perhaps it was your anguish in dying and the fierce desire to go on, mixed with my immediate and severe guilt at seeing all that blood on my hands, that forced my consciousness from my body and allowed yours inside. I don't know. What I do know, however, is that none of us will be at peace until this is settled." "Okay, let's say I do believe you," Ernest spat. "Let's say you killed me and somehow my soul or consciousness or whatever took control of your body. Why don't I remember any of this? Why do I not see myself in your body?" "Think about it, Ernest. Can you honestly say you remember any part of making the trip to this cabin? Packing your luggage? Anything?" he asked. Ernest did his best to recall the details of the warning phone call from Mona that had led to his exodus of the city. He tried to remember any part of the 4-hour drive up to the cabin. He even tried remembering the stop he knew he'd made at the gas up, but just as it had been when trying to rationalize the glasses of bourbon on the coffee table, the process had made him lightheaded. "You're in denial, Ernest. It's a stage of mourning. On some level, it's to be expected. This denial, however, is the deepest denial possible, the kind of denial that transcends death, a denial so consuming that you used my hands to bury your own body right outside this cabin. You imprinted your appearance over my own, while in reality your corpse is out back a few feet in the ground. Somehow, though, I retained some ethereal tether to my body. In the void I was tormented by visions of this place, as seen through my own earthly eyes, but by you. That's how I figured out I could appear to you in the mirrors. Somehow, in this cosmic happenstance, be it by blunder or some malicious god's judicious intent, our fates have become intertwined, Ernest. I am you, and you are me." Ernest sat slack-jawed for a moment, then snorted a fake laugh only to try and ease his own nerves. "So I buried my own body and went on living through you, huh? So what? Sounds like I got a pretty good deal out of it, didn't I? What do you want from me? Your body back?" He snorted again, crossing his arms. "Do you know how fucking crazy that sounds?" Ernest asked him in a tone that could just as easily been intended for himself. "Truth is, I don't think there is any getting my body back, Ernest. As hard as this is for you to believe, I was a good man. I was a good detective, and I was a good husband. I spent my whole life being that man, but in the end, in a moment of weakness, I bathed myself in blood, in your blood, Ernest. No, I don't think there is any way to fully return to the body my consciousness once held dominion over, the same body your conscience does now. I think this may be my punishment, this vast emptiness, this realm of immense vacancy. This is the price I am to pay for giving in to that bloodlust for only a second. I have come here to ask something of you, however, Ernest. You have to kill yourself." "And why would I do that?" Ernest had desisted with his false defensive sarcasm now, and looked deeply at the man on the couch with an eyebrow raised and a scowl of confusion across his face. "While Mona held your body as you bled out, while she told you over and over how much she loved you, I was reloading my service revolver. By the time she looked up at me, screaming at me and cursing my name, I had a full cylinder to profess my undying devotion to our marriage. I put another 6 shots in her. That's the last thing I remember before awakening in emptiness. She's there, Ernest. Mona is there in the void. Something happened that day, Ernest. In all that love that decayed so quickly into hate and spilled out in the blood through bullet holes and silk sheets, something happened. In that moment of unadulterated hatred colliding with my purest love, I may have created this. It's up to you now, however. You have to accept it. That's the only way we'll all be able to move on. That's the only way you'll not be haunted by this for the rest of your life. That's the only way Mona can escape that big empty. You have to accept that you and I and Mona are no longer a part of the world you've clung so hard to. You have to accept it so we can all transcend these vacant, insipid loops that we're caught in. While he spoke, a scratching had once again risen in the record player's speakers behind Peggy Lee singing. A voice spoke from the scratching. It was low and strained and came and went with the music like a radio station cutting into the frequency of another, but it was a voice Ernest knew well. It was a voice Ernest had spoken with earlier that very evening on the old rotary phone that had since been burned up in the fireplace. The voice of an angel, the voice of a goddess, the voice of his muse. Ernest, it's okay. It's okay, Ernest. You have to let go. Mona's voice cried out to him, cutting in and out and intermixing with Peggy Lee's singing. You killed her, Ernest shouted, raising the straight razor to cut into him. And you buried her, Ernest, just out back, right below your own body. With my hands, you buried her and blackened it from whatever passes for a memory in this instant, Ernest, just like you did with your own body. And now she's there, Ernest, in the void. She's there with me. Can't you see there is no separation between the two of us any longer, Ernest? I may have killed her, but you buried her. By staying here, you bury her deeper than any grave of dirt and earth that could ever be dug. You're lying! You killed her, you son of a bitch! You killed her and you came here for me! Ernest held the straight razor between them, ready to strike if he had to, if he could. There's a shovel outside, beside the door. It's the shovel you used, Ernest. If you don't believe me, take the shovel and find out for yourself. You're right beneath the bedroom window out back, and Mona is right beneath you. Go look into your own face with your own eyes. The only thing I can hope is that when you do, you will understand what it is that has to happen next. The door to the cabin slammed open violently and bashed hard against the wall with the fury of the winter wind as snow tumbled in on the carpet and fresh flakes rained from the black sky outside. Ernest jumped abruptly and moved to face the doorway, razor held high. When he turned back to the couch, the specter was gone. In a daze, Ernest slowly walked out the cabin door and into the snowy abyss. The wind's intrusion had quenched the fire and darkened the walls of the cabin and sent the shadows spreading into odd and perverse directions across Ernest as he emerged through the doorway. He reached out and took the wood-handled shovel that leaned against the outside wall, awaiting his arrival, and continued around the cabin. The full moon was radiant and gigantic and reflected glaringly from the solid sheet of untouched snow, providing the night with a luminous glow. The wind's eerie howl, the diminishing sound of the record player, and the snow crunching beneath his feet were the only sounds now as he moved slow and deliberately, eyes forward. When he reached the spot directly below the bedroom window, at the back of the cabin, Ernest began to dig instinctively. It took him 20 minutes to move the snow that had collected the past few days, but as the spade of his shovel finally cleared the white obstruction, his eyes fell upon loose, patted-down dirt. Ernest fell to his knees then, burying his hands in frozen earth and throwing clumps of soil frantically in all directions until his fingers landed on something hard. He swept away the dirt to uncover the face of an antique gangbuster's cigar box. Pulling it up and throwing back the cover, Ernest lay his eyes upon the prominent shape of a black six-shot revolver inside. Upon seeing the gun, Ernest threw the box aside and continued his hysterical clawing until shortly his fingertips fell upon fabric. Desperately excavating the soil covering from what he soon found to be the cotton of a black t-shirt, Ernest pulled dirt from the grave until he had the entire upper chest and shoulders of the body uncovered. When finally he'd swiped the mud from the face, Ernest jolted back, suddenly in terror, and fell into the snow piled behind him. Recovering, he slowly crawled to the edge of the hole and peeked over and in at the body once more to assure himself of what he'd just seen. Staring up at him, dark eyes glassed over an elegantly disheveled stubble now crisp with the collected frost from the freshly falling snowflakes was his own lifeless face, mud and dirt streaking his cheeks from the shallow grave. Ernest leapt to his feet, beginning to pace back and forth the length of the hole, staring into the dead face of himself below. Abruptly, he turned and vomited hard into the snow. Wiping the residual from his chin with his wrist, Ernest turned back to the corpse at his feet with a new determination. Reaching down and looping his hands under his own shoulders, Ernest pulled hard upward, dragging his own body from its resting place. In his peripheral vision, he could see the massive holes in the body's chest, but he wouldn't allow himself to investigate further, for fear he may vomit again. Ernest dragged the corpse until it lay atop a nearby snowbank, clearing the grave for further excavation. It didn't take him long to find what he was looking for. Within the first handfuls of dirt, he touched her cold flesh. By the next, he'd had her face completely uncovered, peering out from their shared frozen tomb. The cold had preserved her perfectly. Her vacant eyes stared into him with their always tranquil green, the shade of a forest canopy in late summer. Her lips were as plump as he remembered, always so kissable, always so inviting. There she laid, out in the back, under the bedroom window, under the gun, under himself. There laid Mona, just as the specter had promised. Ernest stood over her, his knees weak. He began to scream open and loudly, fists clenched and wide mouth open to the heavens. Slowly the scream gave way to sobbing, and then he wept hard, gnashing his teeth, his face buried in black and dirty palms. Feeling like he would collapse, Ernest had turned to pull himself from the grave when he caught sight of himself in the pane of the bedroom window. He rushed toward it, tripping on the edge of the hole and falling against the wall of the cabin. Quickly erecting himself, both hands at the sides of the window pane, he stared with petrified horror at the reflection the glass presented him with. Staring back was the face of his specter. Black hair slicked back, flecked with gray, scars and pockmarks crisscrossing his jaw. The last remnants of what had been lather were now dried on his cheeks in white soap deposits. The unmerciful blue eyes of the visage of Jack Edelon opened and closed with Ernest's own, his mouth twisting and shaping itself into whatever way Ernest contorted his own. Ernest stepped back from the window calmly, suddenly and absolutely exhausted by the evening's events and unsure how to process any of it further. He stopped to pick up the cigar box and revolver at his feet, and standing, tucked them under his arm. Crunching back through the snow, he left the now desecrated gravesite and was greeted by Peggy Lee's voice inviting him back inside as he rounded the cabin. Ernest walked through the door, not bothering to close it. The wind had completely killed the fire now, but the moonlight shining in through the open door gave the room an unnatural silver illumination. Ernest placed the cigar box and its inhabitants on the coffee table and sat down on the couch. Positioning his fingers over the typewriter's keys, Ernest began to punch them in rapid succession. By the time I had arrived at the cabin, it had burned almost completely to the ground. The snow around it had melted in a circle. The scorched and blackened remains jutted up from the earth like some demonic temple. The fire chief of the scene had ruled it suicide by arson. A bottle of coal mine Kentucky bourbon, the most likely incinerant, he'd said, had been found empty next to the cabin's only inhabitant, the charred body of Jack Edelon. Jack had gone missing 4 days earlier. 2 other bodies had been found, excavated from a shallow grave behind the cabin. One had been Jack's wife, Mona. The other had been her lover, Ernest Leonard, the national best-selling author. My name is Harold Price. I worked alongside Jack for 7 years as his partner before his death. I know more than likely this is not the way you expected this story to end, and by God, I wish I could tell you that it didn't. Luckily, I arrived quickly enough at the cabin to uncover 2 pieces of crucial evidence before the scene had been tampered with by the forces of nature and unknowing first responders. The gangbuster cigar box had been placed back in the grave atop Mona's body. Inside, the revolver now served as a paperweight to several sheets of paper, words running the length of them in the deep black of the Remington typewriter's ink. The content of the pages was the course of events over the preceding 4 days as written by Jack Edelon or Ernest Leonard, or a bit of both perspectives, depending on how you choose to believe. It was a blunt report and written matter-of-factly, not as if the author had wanted to impress his beliefs upon anyone, but more so like he needed this account out of him. Why would he need anyone to believe him? At the time the statement had been written, the decision to take his own life had already been made. What you have read above is as close as I am able, or perhaps willing, to come in providing you a written account of the last days of Jack Edelon and Ernest Leonard, as based upon the narrative provided in that statement. Now, you may be wondering what I, as a trained detective, friend, and partner of the murder suspect, may make of the whole incident. I would tell you that it doesn't matter what I make of it. What happened in that cabin over those 4 days is something that none of us may ever understand, and I will make no attempt to for the sake of this writing. I will say that Jack Edelon was a good man, a good detective, and as far as I can say, a good husband, just as he asserts in his final statement. I will say that I feel it is important that his final proclamation of the events as he experienced them over the course of those 4 days be taken into consideration. And finally, I will paraphrase the bard's perspective, as written in Hamlet, by saying there are more things in heaven and earth than can ever be conceived of in the thoughts of man. The second piece of evidence I uncovered that night had also been included with the stack of papers in the cigar box. Written all in the upper left-hand corner in only 10 lines, it was typed out neatly on the very last page in the stack. I sat in the cold and I shivered until I knew what I had to do. I pulled out my revolver and I pointed it at you. I said, "This is for the everything that I will never be." And then I turned that gun around and I pointed it at me. The only way to win this time is not to play the game. But you know me. If I'm going out, I'm going out in flames. Ernest Leonard, Spectre. The end.